Okay, thanks for all the guests and audiences coming for this. And this is the first roundtable for Acoustic Future. And Acoustic Future is a movement I'm coordinating about um, challenging predominant visual culture in industries and raising public awareness of minor senses. And I'm trying to unite powers from practitioners in many fields to like designers, investors, artists, and technologists to help us build a better environment in smart city. And for today, here are four guests: Tahmores Zandi, Daniel Kish, Doris Sung, and Alessio Grancini. And they're both from different fields, like not different fields, but some of them are practicing on different directions in architecture. Uh, I would like to briefly introduce our guest. First, Daniel Kish. He's a special guest of our conversation. He is the president of World Access for the Blind, and he's an expert in echolocation. Since he lost his sight since his childhood, and he used sound as a very important medium to navigate around, and he is helping enhancing acoustic experience, and like he is uh, teaching the whole teaching blind community to use echolocation as a way to navigate around. And for Tahmores Zandi, he's the associate director at SOM architecture firm, and he uh, has some sharp views on ADA codes and industrial standards, and he has years of practice in architecture field. And for Doris Sung, she is the director of USA undergrad architecture, and she uh, practiced on smart materials, uh, working on smart facade and responsive facade and installations in interactive architecture. She runs her own studio, the Dosu Studio. And for Alessio Grancini, he is a prototype engineer at Magic Leap, and he has much experience on AR, VR development, and he has some very pioneering ideas about augmented audio and human augmentation. So I think uh, welcome to join this conversation. For today, first I will start briefing on our previous ideas and cases we discussed, and then it will be a conversation between uh, our guests. And later, there will be some conversation like between audiences and guests. The topic of today's roundtable is sensory diversity and smart city, and it's clear that now we are living in like a city that is becoming smarter and smarter, and now smart devices and technology allow us to do many things we couldn't do before, and that can largely enhance our built environment. And in that condition, there will be more potentials in multisensory experience that the enhance the rights of blind community, and for enhance more choices in the space we design. Previously, we had several discussions. The first happened between me and Daniel. It was in last year. We briefly discussed about the dominant visual culture and how that caused the ignorance in architecture. Here are some point of views. The first, that most people are born visually and trained visually, and spaces we're living in are most designed visually, and that causes some ignorance over blind community and their rights in architecture. And second, as an echolocation expert, he expressed sound as a navigation through the buildings, and that might be a possible practice of the future architect. And third, and here we discuss something about the design of buildings. For example, in some layout of hotels, and for a blind person, it's hard to find their way around, and the layout will be confusing. And the acoustic environment sometimes is annoying because there are too much noise and too much reverb. The second discussion happened between Tahmores and Daniel. And in that discussion, that discussion is mainly about the ADA codes. That first, our ADA codes is not accessible as we thought. Like, we set up tons of brailles and smart devices in buildings, but most of them are not accessible to blind person, and especially they are not accessible for some blind child. And when such navigation system breaks down, nobody knows them except blind person, because most people don't use it. The second, as I mentioned before, the acoustic environment, some of them are not friendly to blind person and are not good for echolocation. The third is it's better to avoid too complicated design in architecture to help a visually impaired person easier to find their way around. The third discussion was with Doris Sung, and she basically proposed some ideas on design and our role as a producer. Like, first, how many choices we provided in our design. Do we consider non-visual groups, how they experience our project in different ways? And the second, that she says space is basically interactive, and responsive environment will better address personal experience, which echoes on personal memory and experience. And for interactive architecture, and Doris Sung as a practitioner on interactive material, it can both function in material and virtual world together to build a better environment. The fourth discussion with Alessio Grancini, we discussed two things. The first is architects can shift in their business, can create partnership with smart device makers and run business with investors from other fields. And second, the spatialized audio will be an important part in smart buildings and responsive environment. It's important to think about what kind of navigation and content are we targeting. And there's the last discussion. It was between Alessio and Daniel. There are 2 points of view. The first is smart devices such as iPhone with smarter and smarter sensors. They should deal with complex environments and help a blind person to navigate around more easily in real time. And second, for navigation, that augmented audio needs to be non-immersive and transparent over real world to avoid danger. And in such an environment, blind person needs to know what is happening around them. There are some cases we discussed. For example, the tactile design in some like in on some stairs, there are some brailles showing uh, where they are going from and where they are going towards. And here's another case I found about tactile is that this person, Joshua Mile, just designed a tactile system for the San Francisco train system, and they can use tactile to know which direction to go, and they can use smart device to access to that label. And another case is smart interface. Daniel mentioned the smart screen in elevator before. He said that he found some hotels are equipped with smart screen, which can provide a very accurate navigation about direction and where to go. There's another case about augmented audio that is Microsoft Soundscape. And Microsoft has worked a lot on this spatialization of audio and sound navigation. And the Soundscape is a example about navigation in the map, and they can use sound in their devices to navigate around in city. And here's the Spatial Studio. I think Alessio mentioned that. It's about augmented audio, creating cinematic experience for some theme parks, and users can access to this acoustic space through their smart devices. This case is from Doris Sung. In her recent work, the Invert project, she designed a facade, smart facade with thermal bimetal, and she said that this facade responds to the heat, and in the morning and in the evening there will be two shifting pattern, and that will create some changes in tactile and acoustic experience. This case is the theater space mentioned by Alessio. There's a mistake on the text. It's a project by Frank Gehry, and there are some tubes in this stadium, and there are some speakers on tubes above the heads of these audiences, and that creates an immersive audio experience. There's another case about the beehive in Kew Garden, and Daniel mentioned that this was created for light and sound experience. It recorded the sound of bee, and that responds to the behavior of the user, and when they step into this installation, that creates a soundscape. So that's a brief introduction for what we had before. And for today, I think it's super interesting that we got so different guests come together to discuss the same topic about how do we create a more inclusive city, a smarter city, and how do we realize that through business, through policies, and through technologies. So who would like to start first?
Well, I can take a crack at it. This was a great summary, and I'm sorry I missed some of those discussions. But I think, well, as an architect, I think the question in my mind is always, what's our duty? What's our social obligation? Not only to do the right thing, but also every one of these features adds to the depth of the space. It makes it richer. It makes the experience richer for every user group. So it goes along the lines of our increased sensitivities which has been an evolving process ever since, you know, we've known ourselves as architects. But what's very interesting is that it seems like the technology might be helping us here, which I hope doesn't let some of us architects get away with just not doing much and just relying on the technological side. Because I still think, and I think maybe that would be a question for Danielle, that do we think smart devices will suffice in navigating the space, or do we still need to be sensitive, and do we still need to push for the passive measures? Like, I mean, the one thing that burned in my memory that Daniel, you mentioned, is that, yeah, we have Braille on a door sign, but how do you get to that door? Yeah, when you get to the restroom and you touch it, you know it's a restroom, but how do you get there? So are we making it easier on architects by relying on technology? Is the technology there? Or should we still try to make buildings respond in an architectural manner, and technology would supplement it? And this is just one of the three pylons. It would be good to expand into then what does that mean for business, and what does it mean for policy / code? Because as we know, until something doesn't become code, it's harder to get everyone on board to do it. So maybe Daniel, do you have any thoughts on, if you have a smartphone, would that really make a building that was otherwise unacceptable navigatable, or are we putting too much?
Well, it could. I mean, a lot of navigational features on smartphones don't yet work particularly well indoors yet. So a lot of this is GPS based, but they're working on systems that could work more effectively indoors. If you had the environment somehow smarter, if you had it marked up with some kind of Bluetooth or RF tags. I mean, there are lots of gizmos out there that will broadcast information. Then, of course, you can design a smartphone to access that information. We're assuming, of course, that everyone's going to have a smartphone, which, you know, may or may not happen. I think one point that I would like to make, not speaking for others, is there are a lot of blind people out there who would not want to interfere with architectural creativity and design. So, you know, there is deference given to what people find aesthetically appealing, and what other people may find functionally appealing. That may or may not be conducive to what a blind person would find appealing or useful. It's just in some ideal world, when a space is designed with whatever creativity in mind, whatever one wants to do with that space for whatever reason, that there is at least some thought given or some consideration given to universal access. But, you know, like you just said, I mean, unless there's coding around that, unless it's very hard to bring people on board. So technology will continue to develop. The other point I'll make, technology will continue to develop, but the more reliance we have on what I'll call environmental modifications. So basically the environment being modified or created to allow various people to function, the more of an uphill battle you kind of have, because there are so many variables to that, and there are so many regions that will or won't sign on to that, and there are so many different ways of responding to that. So my approach tends to focus more on capacity building within the individual to address the environment for what it is. But that, of course, includes self-advocacy to try and, I guess, meet people halfway. So it's helpful if a blind person has the strategies and the self-determination capacity to manage in various environments, while at the same time, those environments being at least to some degree considerate of what blind people find useful.
That kind of reminds me I discussed about this because when we did design products or whatever, the way it being experienced or used and how it functions, it's hard to be defined, right? And it's hard to predict that. And sometimes, I guess, just like Doris said, we just need to provide more options, and through these options, we just need to test if this works, if that works, and if that helps blind person, if this helps.
It's interesting because my first question, not knowing a lot, about what the ideal scenario is what should even be the baseline? So is it better to have a space that is silent, right? And then starting to add certain sounds to that environment to build some kind of soundscape that might be navigational or spatial, etc. Or is it the opposite, where it's actually a lot of noise or white noise or other types of things that would be a better backdrop to it? So in some ways, would you actually design the architecture first to achieve that baseline level and then adjust it accordingly after that? Or even that gadgets like the iPhone or other things would actually alter that baseline? Does that make sense? So that the options are controlled by elements that are put in there or added or subtracted from it.
I mean, one thing again that I remember from one of the talks with Daniel that was really stood out for me was, typically in architecture, we try to, the noisy spaces are the circulation areas, and the more acoustically sensitive spaces are offices. And then for a blind person, that circulation area is actually where it needs to be a little bit more acoustically, designed so they don't have all the reverb. And then when they're in the office, they're in the office. So it's kind of the reverse of, and again, not to say like we need to reverse everything, but I feel like if these layers are added into our designs, it would make it, in my opinion, richer. So not to speak for Daniel, but I feel like the less reverb, the easier to navigate.
It is one of the issues that came up actually in our discussion. Yes, that's one area. I mean, there's huge amounts of diversity out there. So I try not to speak for people. But one of the things that cuts across a range of diversity in the population is how people process sound and noise and reverb. And reverb basically just muddies up the waters. I mean, unless there's a reason to have the reverb, maybe in a performance space or something. But the wetter the environment, the more reverberant an environment, the less distinctive are individual sounds, for one thing, and the more layers occur around sounds to essentially just cause more noise. So reverberant environments amplify themselves to become very noisy very quickly. And you have not just blind people, you have people who are on the autistic spectrum, you have people with various kinds of acute noise sensitivities, you have people with hearing impairments. All of these people and more will struggle and do struggle in reverberant environments.
What about space like recording studio? Because that is kind of extremity of quiet place.
That's probably going too far in the other direction. I mean, of course, there are times and places for those kinds of spaces, sound dampened rooms and anechoic chambers and things. But I mean, if you have something kind of in the middle, something that acts to dampen reverb without, you know, without being overly absorbent, it seems like that's the kind of index you want to shoot for. And this is particularly true. This is particularly true for many children as well. When we're talking about classroom design, when we're talking about auditorium design, any kind of space, learning spaces for children who may not have developed their own adaptation capacities and really do struggle with these kinds of spaces.
Maybe I can get in here just to add some concerns. Like I think before has been mentioned, both from if I mispronounce the name, I don't want to do it wrong, but Tahmores, sorry, and Doris, you guys mentioned the fact that like it's hard to understand the context of a project of this kind, and I agree with that because there are a lot of variants, and in architecture specifically and design, there's not really this kind of a common understanding of segmentation of users or kind of finding your niche of whoever you're building for. I mean, you have your use case for commercial, residential, and like the kind of architecture you're building, but I've never seen, at least from my brief experience in the architecture practice, an analysis to go and get so many people that have been in space before and then gathering data from the feedback of this person. And in this case would be blind persons or anyone else that classify as a future inhabitants of the architecture. In that sense, maybe all of this conversation to me, if I really would like to make an impact on what is being told, like maybe a question is also like, how would you start this process of analysis and making choices on that analysis? How would you frame your practice to make decision on the need of people rather than like maybe like business driven need in that sense? So maybe that could be something that could be affecting the practice. Since before it's been asked like from Tahmores, what is the role of the architect in all of this? Like in this sense, for me, at least I see that it's a lot of work of gathering data before to making any sort of decision probably. But I'm happy to know what you guys think.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, Alessio. And I think historically, we gather data in a very slow, organic manner of, you know, year after year, learning a little bit more, chipping at it. Every 3 years, the code gets updated with a little bit more stuff. It's kind of a collective knowledge versus actively really going after the users. And don't know how that would happen, what it would look like, but we just go based on historic knowledge that we have of the user groups when we start designing buildings. And as such, we oversee certain needs. And hence, this is where we are.
That data would be especially helpful for those of us who are not sensitive enough to know the answers to, you know what I mean, what the answers are to these things. That what, you know what I mean, again, everything from the baseline to something that's very sensitive and particular or detailed, and it just gets worse and worse. So how do we come up with some criteria or data set or recommendations that, like you said early, you know what I mean, that can actually help architects who are not sensitive to it, who don't know these things. I think there's similar things to smell, and I think all these stories start to come out now this past year during COVID when people lost the sense of smell. how critical and important that was, to even life safety. Listening to someone talk about, smell, she almost died because she could not smell carbon, the gas that was going on in her house, and she was about to light the stove and was saved from it by someone else who did smell. So all these things, to those of us who are not sensitive, how can we figure out a way to get to the understanding of those areas? And I think the data sets are probably part of that.
I think that that's super important to me, and I guess the reason why this data set is kind of a concept that is not being crossed over enough, let's say, in design. It's first of all, it's because design is a practice that is still very much based on artistic sense. So for sure, it's not like priority in a sense, but also the fact that what I want to say, the fact that, like, for example, right now, I don't know if you see this Apple event recently. They just released new products. They released this thing called AirTag, and the product use case is it's very fun. Like the use case that they find is, say you lost your keys of your car and you don't find it, and so we have this kind of little attachment to your keys that can be trackable anywhere in space. The truth, for me, at least what I think, is that, like, that's a very much of an additional tracker of your habits, like is happening with, working with VR and AR, like just thinking about Oculus and all of these things, they really get everything of you. And they have an enormous data set that they can make choices on how to make their things, but they're not planning cities, they're planning products. So there is a totally different end. But I wonder if anything of it can be applied to urban planning scenario, or a big project, or an infrastructural project.
I guess there is a big difference about getting this data set. Like, architecture is a whole different process than game or product, because you don't have chance to test that in, like, the real thing. Yeah. And where do we get this data? Like, for voting? Or do we do questionnaires, or do we get data from, like, previous? I don't know. It's a hard question to answer.
It is. Sorry, did I interrupt?
No, I mean, I just wanted to add, we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. And so for the first time, we're really seeing this potential to see, before something's built, the aspects of the sound, even though it's still a work in progress. And my argument will be that because of that, there will be a shift in terms of behaviors and attitudes in requesting that as well.
What do you mean? What do you mean, though? I mean, like,
Well,
like request, or the way that people are requesting, or is the protocols going to change?
No, in the sense that you can't, when it comes to sound in the past, there was no way to really give you a good sense of what it would sound, what this broom is going to sound like. I could show you a building, I could show you plans and sections, but the sound aspect, I would argue, was harder to replicate.
Mm-hmm.
And that's changing very, very quickly.
But there could virtually be a simulation modeling program, right, that could try at best to consider materiality as part of that. I don't know. Maybe that's.
That's what I totally agree with. I think what's exciting with the technology is that we're going to have more of an ability to see, the sound aspect.
Yeah.
There's going to be a way of showing it beforehand, before the design's made. And I think that's the thing that's exciting about moving forward.
It is. And I think, again, going to the 3 pylons that Yufan identified, business policies, having that knowledge probably can help us push, because at some instances we already know we're not necessarily making the best decision, but there's nothing that mandates people to do it. So it feels like they need to go hand to hand. We have the technology to foresee what's going to happen, but we also need to push this group, being the architects and the professionals, and the clients group, which maybe in one of these talks we should have a developer on the call, you know, and say, hey, you know, how can we make a business case, how, you know, for creating a more sensitive environment. So yeah, point I'm saying is that having the technology is very helpful. We may have to do a little bit more than that to push the needle.
I will say, being a father of 2 autistic children, that this is something that I live with day in and day out in terms of the acoustic. Their sensitivity is much more pronounced. And, you know, autism is something we're seeing more of, you know, throughout the States. And so, you know, in response to what you're saying, in that case, it becomes a necessity versus, you know, an option.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think on the same note, on the other end too, I think the numbness to it also increases with the amount of megadata and information out there that we get. It's the same thing with visual, right? They say that we're looking at thousands of more visuals a day than anyone ever did 40 years ago in a single day. And the same thing happens with that sound and music and all these types of things, so that there's a numbness that happens. There, you know, it's funny because I didn't talk to Yufan about this before, but you know, it's come up more recently that I'm working on a project, and most of my work is actually very visual, right? That you can actually see the stuff changing and moving, but it's actually fairly slow moving, and many people get frustrated by it, which is actually quite funny because it's just not moving fast enough, and it's not, you know, what I mean, visual enough to what they see while they're sitting there. And so to offset that, I decided to do an installation that we're doing right now that actually makes sound, so that it almost in a very light way alerts you to the movement, the visual movement that you can't see by hearing it. And actually in this case, you can hear it better than you can actually see it, which is a very funny and odd thing. But it's, again, just right now, just an installation. And it makes people more aware of that kind of sound and movement through, it makes people more aware of the movement, actually, physical movement, three-dimensional movement of these pieces through sound.
It seems Karen, our audience, has a question.
Yeah, one thing that that came to mind was, Yufan, is that you're missing a bubble on your 3 bubbles. There's a 4th bubble that many of us are very much involved with, which is education. There needs to be more at the student level. There needs to be more at the professional level. There could be a best practices type of booklet prepared. Students could learn more about people who are impaired or in different ways. For example, one of our speakers last year made a very good statement as his final statement. He asked the students to look at their projects and think to themselves, who am I excluding with my design? Mm-hmm. And just the fact that that people now have to think about that, and he set it up really well, right? He gave a whole range of things that you could be, types of people you could be excluding, but I thought that that was just a really good way of looking at it. And the other thing I wanted to mention was that this affects people, let me turn off my reaction, also at different levels. There are people who are partially sighted, who are fully blind. I know when I take off my glasses that sometimes even I'm on the edge of, I'm going to hit by a car and not even know it, kind of thing. I know as I'm getting older that my eyesight is failing. And that many of us, when we get older, we are going to have problems, even more problems with our eyes. And so I think that the number of people affected is much more than people, architects, designers initially think are being affected. And I think that the ADA requirement started with the idea, oh, there's only a couple of people who we have to worry about in wheelchairs. And it's like, no. I'm carrying 2 bags of groceries. I can't take the stairs either. So I think that awareness has happened for one group, and hopefully that'll make the awareness grow for other groups as well.
That's actually a very good point, Karen, too, because as the baby boomers are getting older and older, the number of those people increase.
I mean, especially today, we are so relying on screens, and it's just like incredible. Like I, without my glasses, and see anything. So I totally double on what you said, and I mean, I'm also like, especially the work we're trying to do with augmented reality and virtual reality is always trying to bring more physicality to the work, because like our life is really sedentary and like in front of a flat screen. So in that sense, I'm most excited to work in the field to make up for that problem. But I acknowledge how much reliant on screens we are on everything. And so sound really could be coming handy in the future, absolutely, because it would be great to have a way to just like relax your eyes also for a moment, like for everyone, not just blind person, but like really like, or half blind persons, like everyone really. I think they should really think in these terms. Yeah.
But can it go also a little too far? So one area that still makes me nervous is the screens that you talked about in automobiles, like for backup, for your rear screens, right? And that so many people don't even need to look outside the window to back their car up. And the reliance on it is incredible, right? And the same thing with sound in the car too. So as your car is getting close to the side or another car, you hear alarms going off. And so do we become so reliant on those devices that we don't need our own senses to drive a car or to prevent accidents? I mean, does it get to a point where it actually goes too far, or not, or does it just augment it?
I guess Daniel will give the best answer because he deals with real sound in real world, and he just rely on his own to navigate around.
Yeah, it's both. I mean, we're all presented with options to extend or augment our sensory or perceptual capacities in various ways, and then each of us has the choice or option to take that too far. How many people can read maps anymore? That used to be, pretty common, and the Thomas Guide was a real thing, and people had one in their car, and now people are pretty reliant on GPS, and sometimes you see them driving in circles. So I think the offer is always made, and then there's a certain kind of human discipline that has to come into play, and could be inspired through education, and arguably should be inspired through education to be disciplined about how we use tools and technologies.
I mean, that's why when we talked in the last panel, I always try to go in the direction of smart devices. Of course, that quickly becomes an issue also of privacy. And that's something that concerns everyone because we're relying on always more on digital, but my goal, I think, as a designer, technologies is really appropriate myself of these tools as much as I can for making the right decisions, right? Because there are a lot of conversations that don't really involve design component, rather involve a product design component. So that's why I think starting from education, as has been mentioned previously from Karen, we should really point this out to new coming generation and say, especially from the architecture side, because I don't think that any other education is so, let's say, thoughtful in the process. Not as much as architecture when it comes to a service, right? Like, so I think that's the difference that the field can really give for future students.
I guess it's important that we should get more like designer, artists, or architects to take part into this practice. Like Karen mentioned, the education, how we are educated. I think in my first discussion with Daniel, that he said that most people in our world are born visually, educated visually, and such, like we inherently ignore and exclude these non-visual people. So I think for especially for architecture school, it's important that it's not just about ADA codes, it's more about an overall awareness of this school, of this education system, and our students can be a like more inclusive architect that can serve different communities better.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think everyone on this call that does architecture knows how much these days more and more our IT consultants are sought after, and how much more they're doing in buildings, and how much less I understand from terms they're using. You know, the infrastructure they put on buildings is just so different than what it used to be 20 years ago, and it changes so rapidly. But at the end of the day, I think the design of the building itself needs to also be reactive. It needs to be sensitive. And again, as humans, we're getting more knowledge about not different people, different levels of ability, different cultures. You know, it keeps going. I mean, just look at the stuff that happened last summer and how much it shook the society. We need to implement that. We need to push ourselves to keep on getting more inclusive with our designs. And not only is the right thing, but it also makes up for a richer architecture, one that hopefully future generations will, you know, look back to and say, well, these guys were really getting into it. So I think we shouldn't rely too much on the technology part. We should do our part also.
I have a question actually, too. Given this conversation that we're having, should it, and if so, how should it, I think Karen alluded to it, potentially affect and change education? So in the education of an architect, and during the education, how can it change the way we educate students?
I'm going to quickly
too. Sorry.
I was just going to, sorry. We used to have assignments at some schools of architecture where people went around like campus in a wheelchair, and then people went around blindfolded. And it's a little dangerous depending on, but that would just makes the point that one, it's not as easy, and it can be dangerous for other people also. But part of it is giving them that gut feeling of what it's like. It's going to be different because it's only being done to them for like an hour. So it's not a real fair thing. They don't have some of the accommodations that would be made, but it at least gets people thinking about it. And maybe it's possible to make virtual worlds and games and things like that that people might want to play, where you're told, you got the luck of the draw. Sorry, you're playing this game and you happen to be blind, or you happen to be only, well, in a wheelchair, or you happen, and now you're playing this space and trying as you go along to think of how you would improve those spaces so that you would have equal ability to react in these spaces. So I think part of it is the minimum baseline, as you were talking about earlier, Doris, of what's the minimum that should be done? Folks, are we actually just doing what the minimum that should be in code and everybody should have that access? Then let's think about how to make all the spaces better for all people by having sensitivity to these issues. I mean, maybe we can put sounds, more fountains. Maybe having a fountain will help people direct in one direction. Other people benefit from the fountain in some other way.
And I think along with that goes the idea, again, having talks like this with more and more professionals going around firms every 3 years as architects or as any stakeholder, we have the opportunity to show up to the building council, raise our hands when we don't agree with the portion of the code. So I think it's really important to, I mean, for one, it was my take on the portions of the CBC and ADA that we're following changed so much after talking with Danielle. And I think it's important to broadcast that message that minimum is not the code. What we have in the code right now is really very, I mean, while it's better than nothing, it's very symbolic and it doesn't really address a lot of the issues. So we need to change that minimum for sure.
Yeah. And then, and Yufan, with your thesis project and stuff, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you end up doing as a student, with your research.
It's kind of not off topic, but yeah, for my thesis project is basically use your phone and smart devices to get your spatial data and transform the spatial data into a sound feature, a sound distort. And that variation of sound reminds user of scale, direction, and where they are heading at, and the distance. So it kind of it works in both ways. The first is for sound navigation. If like last time I discussed with Alessio and Daniel that for navigation it shouldn't be immersive and it should be safe for blind person to navigate around. And another branch of application, it would be augmented experience, like in gallery, and you can be blindfolded and you can be non-sighted, but when you use these smart devices, when you walk around, you can experience like an album, like a musical construction. So it's all about acoustic space. That's what I'm doing.
I'd like to add something on this, since it's always connected with what the students are doing today. I've been lucky to be invited to do a workshop for the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, because a friend of mine is teaching there. His name is Kaiho. I don't know if you guys are there. But yeah, we are doing this workshop that is very interesting because it's about how to navigate building, and we are using machine learning to understand how to generate data on navigating building. So you put those agents through a lot of different challenges, and you can synthetically, let's say, train all of this data and generate an enormous amount of data for your building, and then make choices out of those data. I think that's an amazing workshop that they're doing, and I'm very, very happy to be with them and doing it there, because it really pushes me to see what is possible doing today, right? It's really something that you picked up so quickly and it's so available to you, and those are tools that everyone can just download and start using. So that could be also something else, informing design decision, because you're not making design through those tools, you're informing the design decisions, but the way you do it is really, it's absolutely advanced and almost the way you just gather all those data and you provide them and you talk about it. The students are super talented too, so they're doing amazing work in that sense. So maybe that's something else to apply to education and architecture too.
There is a question in the chat. With multisensory devices becoming the norm, wouldn't this inevitably shift the focus from Oculus-centric design?
I guess, sorry, I was trying to do it while I was doing three other things. The, I guess my thing is again, you know, technology is changing rapidly. And to me, the biggest change would be these multi-sensory devices in terms of the way we interact with the built environment. Because once that happens, it becomes more of the norm. I know it's not the norm yet. We're gonna immediately start including our other senses in terms of how we interact with these things, even more so than we did from the past. And to me, as a result, then it brings in the other sensory aspects to a more heightened degree. And I guess that was my question is like, was basically y'all's feeling about multi-sensory devices, and if this is something you believe would do this.
What I'm trying to get my head around this, Mel. What is an example of a multi-sensory device?
So the idea is that with a hand gesture, with your eyes, with a certain bodily movement, things are done. You no longer need the keyboard anymore. You no longer need the computer screen.
Mm-hmm.
Things are now embedded into the facade. And obviously, this is an early stage. But to me, this is a drastic change in the built environment and the implications. Because, you know, think about it, the mouse no longer exists in the near future.
The point I'm agree on is that for these smart devices, it's important. It allows people to navigate around with them, and such spatial data can be used for navigation or experience, and designer can operate on that. I guess that's, yeah, these functions are embedded in our body because we know how to move around, and we have our sensory organ over like gravity, direction, and for sound. So I guess the human augmentation is not going to, it's already becoming a reality. And like, for example, the cases we discussed before, the Microsoft augmented sound, that they are simulating this sound from direction and simulating a real soundscape. But I guess the next step will be, how will user be freely to navigate around with this augmented space and these devices? I think that's important because, like for Daniel, he used sound to navigate around. But what about when he navigate around working in the real world? He's hearing another layer, and that becomes a navigation. So I guess the smart devices is going to solve many issues we've been worrying about for a long time.
They have that potential. It kind of depends on the direction, because, you know, there's sort of a double-edged sword to digital developments and smart developments. And on the one hand, you have potentially expanded options for access, and on the other hand, you have what we sometimes call the digital divide. So as graphic user interfaces, for example, become more and more complex, they also become more and more difficult to access and more difficult to build accessible features into. So it depends a little bit on, well, it depends a lot on the direction that is taken.
Absolutely agree. And to point out also this one, with more technology comes, again, like a lot of issues in terms of privacy, and things go a little bit crazy. For example, like currently, always bringing the example of Oculus. Oculus released this device. This is like $300. And it's like, for the price, it's an enormous amount of quality and data. And like it's something you don't find around for those money, but those money, there's a reason why it's so cheap. It's because they are paid back with all of the data that you agree on using those devices. And if you want a version that doesn't collect your data, the plus that you have to pay is around $500. And those plus is considered an enterprise version. And I mean, more than the double of the price that is being sold for not collecting your data. That's kind of crazy to me. Like, that's enormous. That says a lot of things. So like that device, when you buy it, and I actually have it, damn it. Like, so when you buy it as a normal customer, collects your height, the size of your hands, size of your fingers, how much space you're tracking in your house. So they know more or less how much is the average of every living room of every American that owns an Oculus. And they also get the scanning of your interiors spaces, because that's what you do on that device. So just saying it, you know, like that's another issue that rises up. Like, that's a very amazing device with in the future, but still the compromise is enormous. So sometimes I'm okay with architecture as a slow practice, because sometimes it's really needed, right? Yeah, sorry, you have raised your hand.
Yeah.
Like,
It's okay. I was going to take a different stance on Mel's question. Is I think that we're going to have multisensory devices which are going to provide options, and options are really good. But I think I agree with Daniel that what's going to also happen is there's just going to be more and more development on the things that are based on vision also. It's not like people are going to all of a sudden decide that sound or smell or some other sense should be driving them. Unfortunately, we're really hardwired by evolution to depend on our eyes. We're just, I mean, if we were a dog, we'd be hardwired to our noses. But it really is a physical connection. And so it's going to have to also be a choice, and hopefully an enlightened choice as well, when dealing with some of these multisensory devices.
Yes.
What about Tommy? I guess
I'm a little cavemanish still. I feel like once it's dominant enough, we're going to start to see the effects of it, and who knows how those effects will be. I feel like because we're on an earlier development phases, it's hard to predict how we'll be reacting. But definitely very exciting future, and you know, it's coming our way whether we like it or not. There's robots that dance nicer than I do, and you know, not a great dancer, but still, they're, you know, they react to the senses of the robot across from it. It's just, you know, we've gone very far, and it's just gonna go farther whether we like it or not. So, but yeah, I don't think that specific technology is so dominant yet that we know how it's gonna affect the built environment.
A very interesting episode recently for the New York Police Department. They deployed like I think around 12 units of those dog robots, the spot robots from Boston Dynamics, the one that looks like a dog. And just recently they removed it because you know, the governments took like a very big stand on it, and they just like said, no, this is not going to happen now, at least, right? But so there were like a pushback from the city, and and they used those funds for schools, and that was like a big news, because usually never happens. Like, it's going against the current. So like, I think that in the end, there is always a decisions of whoever is at the lead of those moves. And if you do it in the right way, you can actually do it in the right way. So definitely education, again, is one of the main things to have leaders in the future that takes the right decisions, probably, because that's what makes the difference, the movement change. But yeah, like definitely an exciting exciting possibilities, you know, like, and I looking forward, like I guess anyone.
For the rest of our audiences, do you have any questions? Would you like to join our discussion? Okay, I guess,
There's a lot to chew on, so
yeah. Okay, it's 7 o'clock. I guess the time is a little bit exceeding, but yeah, it's so excited to have you all around the same table discussing some really interesting topics, and we got some very active audiences, and great. Thank you all for participation, and I think it's going to end. Thank you.
Thank you for
Daniel.
putting all
For
together.
organizing this. It's very interesting.
Thank you, absolutely.
Thank you very much.
thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.